My name is Sherry Bowman, and I am from the Pueblo of Laguna, and I am AIANTA's Education Support Specialist, and will be serving today as your webinar moderator. Again, welcome to the presentation of the first Lewis and Clark webinar series. I will also be managing the questions and answers at the end of the presentation, so if you have any questions, please place them in the Q&A box. For those of you that are not familiar with AIANTA, for nearly 2 decades, AIANTA has served as the national voice for American Indian nations engaged in cultural tourism. In addition to serving as the voice for Indian country tourism, AIANTA provides technical assistance and training to tribal nations and native-owned enterprises engaged in tourism, hospitality, and recreation. AIANTA's mission is to define, introduce, grow, and sustain American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian tourism that honors traditions and values. AIANTA's educational offerings include our annual American Indian Tourism Conference, which is AITC, the only tourism conference dedicated to providing training and networking opportunities specific to American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian cultural tourism. Reimagine, reemerge, reunite, stronger together in Indian country is the theme of this year's conference, now celebrating its 23rd year. This year's conference will take place in person at the Wekopa Casino Resort on the Fort McDowell Yavapai Nation in Arizona from October 25th through the 28th. Registration is now open, and you may also visit our website at aianta.org to learn more about our education program offerings, and at aianta.org/AITC for additional information and registration for this year's 23rd Annual American Indian Tourism Conference. We also invite you to join AIANTA in the second session of our interactive new town hall series hosted by AIANTA's board president, Emerson Vile, and Ms. Sherry L. Rupert, AIANTA CEO. The next town hall meeting is scheduled for June 30th at 1:00 p.m. Mountain Time. In this session, AIANTA will hold an open dialogue about its consumer travel site, nativeamerica.travel, the site which offers travel recommendation to visitors interested in exploring indigenous experiences throughout the country, offers free listing for all federally and recognized states and tribes, recognized tribes, as well as all Native-owned hospitality industry enterprises. You can register now on the aianta.org website under the Town Hall series, and we will also add the link in the chat box. At this time, I would like to ask you a few poll questions, so if you would please answer the questions, I will share the results with you. The first one is, what region do you represent? So if you could just click on the region you are from, which is Alaska, Pacific, Southwest, Midwest, Plains, or Eastern. The second question is, how familiar are you with the Lewis and Clark story? The first one is not at all, somewhat familiar, very familiar. So thank you for taking the time to do that. And I see the polls are still coming in, and it looks like right now we've got quite a few people from the Pacific. And those that are familiar are just, they're very familiar with this Lewis and Clark Trail, so that's great. So thank you for participating. I will share the results now. So we've got the Pacific with 33%, followed by the Midwest. And then we have 47% of you that are very familiar with the Lewis and Clark Trail, and then 44% that are somewhat familiar. Well, thank you again for taking the poll. We appreciate it. And so right now, again, thank you for joining us for this webinar, The Voices Along the Lewis and Clark Trail. More than 200 years ago, Captain Merriweather Lewis and Second Lieutenant William Clark set out on a 3-year journey to map the western portion of the United States and to expand trade with Indians along the route. From 1999 to 2006, NPS conducted an unprecedented outreach effort to involve tribes in the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial Commemoration and to incorporate their stories into this historic event. The The program culminated in presentations from more than 400 Native storytellers, artists, musicians, historians, scholars, and leaders in the tent of many voices. Now, 20 years later, NPS has partnered with AIANTA to build on this success and to continue to identify places where travelers can explore the history, heritage, and culture of the tribes along the trail. I'm so pleased to introduce our speakers today, starting with Dan Wiley. Dan is the Chief of Resources Stewardship with the Lewis and Clark National Historic Trail with the National Park Service. Dan holds a Bachelor of Science in Natural Resources, Wildlife Management with graduate work in plant and animal ecology. Dan taught alternative energy at the college level and was a private landscaping habitat consultant before working up through Nebraska's Natural Resources District to general manager. Dan has 18 plus years with the National Park Service, and the last 13 years have been with the Lewis and Clark National Historic Trail. Next, we have Otis Halfmoon. Otis is retired from the National Park Service after a distinguished career as an interpreter and manager of such sites as the Big Hole National Battlefield, Bear Paw Battlefield, Nez Perce National Historic Park, and as a tribal liaison for the Lewis and Clark National Historic Trail and the National Trails Intermountain region. As a citizen of the Nez Perce tribe, Otis, whose traditional name is Pacotis Aoyin, 5 Wounds, was raised in his homelands. Otis' father taught him stories and traditions of the land and the people, but as a teenager, visited the park and listened to non-native interpreters. He quickly realized the stories were not being told. The stories being told were not the ones he learned from his father. Otis knew then he wanted to work for the Park Service. His quote is, he saw working for NPS as an opportunity to tell the untold stories that were not in the history books. Otis received his BA from Washington State University. He remains a sought-after master of ceremonies for powwows and gatherings. We also have Alan Pinkman Sr., a tribal historian and storyteller. Alan is Nez Perce Nimipu and the great-great-grandnephew of Chief Joseph. He co-authored Lewis and Clark Among the Nez Perce, Strangers in the Land of Nimipu with Stephen Evans. In addition to serving as the chairman of the Circle Advisors for the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial, Alan has served as chairman of the Nez Perce tribe, president of affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians, and vice president of the National Congress of American Indians. He has also served on the National Museum of the American Board of Indian Trustees as chairman of the Chief Joseph Foundation and chairman of the Cultural Committee of Wisdom Keepers. He shares his stories of creation, coyote, and monsters with visitors touring his country. During this webinar, Otis and Alan will share some of the tribal perspectives of the bicentennial and how the commemoration continues to drive collaboration and conversations. They will discuss how they have interpreted tribal stories to the public and the importance of participating in presented tribal voices in the retelling of history, and how this can help drive economic growth through cultural heritage tourism. So right now, I'll turn the webinar over to Dan Wiley, who will give a brief introduction of the trail and partnership with AIANTA and the National Park Service.
Well, thank you, Sherry. The National Park Service administers the Lewis and Clark National Historic Trail. It's now from Pittsburgh all the way to the Pacific, 4,900 miles in length, and 60 plus tribal homelands, 16 different states, 5 major ecoregions. So it's quite a transect across the states. The purpose of the trail is to commemorate the 1803 to 1806 Lewis and Clark expedition through the identification, protection, interpretation, public use and enjoyment, and preservation of historic, cultural, natural resources associated with the expedition and its place in U.S. and tribal history. The trail has a history of providing platforms for tribal voices. When Gerard Baker was the superintendent during the bicentennial commemoration, he was involved in helping to develop the Circle of Tribal Advisors. And during that bicentennial commemoration, as Sherry referred to, the tent of many voices, lots and lots of tapes, 1,700 tapes of speakers on the platform that was provided by the National Park Service. After the bicentennial, Richard Bash, Dick Bash was the American Indian liaison for the trail. He was very strong on us continuing with the legacy, and we developed the Lewis and Clark Trail Legacy website that contains some of those Tom V tapes. And we have the entire collection in a where we have what's the right word, archived, and we hope to develop a website whereby all of the Tom V tapes can be available. We're working on that, in fact, this year, and continue to work on it. The Honoring Tribal Legacies educational program is another contribution that the Trail Administration has provided, and we're very, very proud of that. We also contributed to enough good people. So we're very, very much oriented toward the tribal voice. So that is why I'm so happy to represent the trail here today. We are pleased with the partnership with AIANTA that we have had for the last 20 months. And we continue to work with this wonderful tribal tourism organization to bring tribal voices to the public, the tribal nations, to connect people along the trail to the tribal stories along the trail. Most recently, we're doing the Lewis and Clark National Historic Trail Experience, which is the Lewis and Clark.travel website that is just all about geotourism or sustainable tourism. It's about sustaining the natural, cultural, recreational communities on the Great Waterways and the overland portions of the Lewis and Clark National Historic Trail. So I thank you for taking the time today to hear these two Nez Perce powerful voices. And with that, I will turn it over to Otis Halfmoon.
Thank you, and thank you very much. Yes, my name is Otis Halfmoon. Very good try, Sherry. That's Pakatas Aoyen is my name. And anyway, you made a good try. But first of all, I'm very honored here to be part of this webinar, and also like to say thank you again to this organization here being led by Sherry Rupert, the CEO, and her staff. AIANTA has done an outstanding job in reaching out to the tribes, working with the tribes, and also to bring the idea of tourism, the concept of tourism to reservations. So again, thank you very much for this opportunity there to AIANTA organization. Yes, and again, we have about 20 minutes for a discussion on this, and it's amazing though to past week or so trying to think about some of the real good activities and memorable activities that occurred during the bicentennial planning days, of which I was really involved with doing the planning, the beginning days with my superintendent. And it was something. And I know I made a lot of friends out there, and also reacquainted a lot of other friends as well. And I noticed on the message here, see one of our friends from the Umatilla Confederated Tribes, Roberta Connor, is on board here. And again, hello, Roberta. Nice to see your name come across the screen. But anyway, there's a lot of other people that came in. And I know during the time of the planning, I was working for the Nez Perce National Historical Park out of Spalding, Idaho. And one of the sites I was in charge of was the Lolo Pass, the Lolo Trail, going through the mountains between Idaho and Montana. And that place is so beautiful up that area. But anyway, that's when we started hearing rumblings about the bicentennial for Lewis and Clark. And I talked to my superintendent about it, Mr. Frank Walker, and asked if I can be involved with this. And I was given permission to do this. And I went down to a meeting in St. Louis one time, and by the Arch, and we had a big old huge meeting there, all kinds of people, and I was just there just to listen, really. And I was alarmed as far as the amount of people that they're talking about that wanted to follow the trail. We're talking about thousands and millions and all these things, which thank goodness did not transpire, but still numerous ones came along the trail. And if you've ever been up on the Lolo Pass area, that place is still pristine, very much like it was back in 1805 and 1806. And I start worrying about our Vision Quest sites, our burial sites, our gathering sites, and all the stories that go with it for the families of the Nez Perce people. And I could not see the environment being impacted in this nature. And so the alarm bells started coming out, and that's when I did a little more research into it. And thank goodness it's already being looked at already by people like Alan Pinkham Sr., Dr. Rain Tom, Ginny Eater. And so I appreciate the work that they've done, because they were the ones that changed the idea of celebration, to an observance, and there was nothing to celebrate, because it is a tribal story. I saw the amount of people that were very familiar with the Lewis and Clark story already, and we knew that story to be a tribal story. And the intent was, my job when Gerard Baker hired me was to reach out to the tribes to try to get those untold stories, the untold stories that they've never been told before at all to a lot of the historians of the Lewis and Clark story. And that was a challenge. And again, to kind of condense some of the things that we learned through that, the tribes had really nothing to do with Lewis and Clark, because it was the beginning of the end. It was the beginning of the end of much of who we are. And I know when I talked to my tribal council way back when, I did talk to them to be involved with this. And I know the chairman at the time, or actually wasn't a chairman, it was one of the members of our council, and turned around and says, we should have killed him. That was the beginning of the end. And that's how many tribes felt that same way. So my job was, again, to reach out to some of the people to tell that story, because as I found out, National Park Service, I bought some of my experience in there. It seemed to be that the NPS liked to rely on ethnographers, historians, and things that were not tribal, were not indigenous, and they were the ones that telling the stories for us. So it is my job, as far as I was concerned, and Gerard Baker at the time, to reach out to the tribes and say, it is your turn. Let's hear the stories that have not been told. And some of the tribes, they did not want to. And I explained to them that, if you don't tell your own stories, these other people will tell it for you. And that's something, the challenge I had working with the National Park Service, to say that tribes can do their own talking. We do not need these ethnographers, historians to do that for us. We're very, very capable, and we articulate enough to be able to get the point across to our audience. So that was some of the things that the challenge I had with the National Park Service, and also too with the tribes. And again, there's each tribe, you think about it, many of them had their own ideas, and I know they had nothing to do with the Lewis and Clark. I know the Blackfeet Nation, I dealt with people like Curly Bear Wagner and some of the other council up there in Brown, Montana. And they remembered on a return journey in 1806 where some of the two Blackfeet people were killed. In fact, you ask a lot of the Lewis and Clark enthusiasts as far as how many people died in the journey, the expedition, they say, well, only one at the very beginning. And I said, there's 3, 2 Blackfeet members and that person that died along the Missouri. And again, that surprises people. It was really a challenge and a lot of fun as far as as personal growth for myself, as well as an employee of the National Park Service. And it was a humbling experience in many respects, because I know one time I dealt with the Lakota tribes in South Dakota. Now again, I've been reaching out to this tribe for quite a while to be involved with the Lewis and Clark, to tell their own Lakota story as they saw fit. And they would not return my phone call. And finally, I did reach the chairman of the tribe. For that, I'm not going to say which band of Lakota, but there was, and he talked to me and he was saying, "I know you've been trying to get a hold of me. And I also know too who you are. I researched you. I see you're a powwow person. You're an MC. You're raised on a reservation. But as far as I'm concerned, you're a government Indian." Now, to be told that was amazing to me. It's eye-opening as far as how many of the tribes view this Lewis and Clark story. Again, it did not matter. But again, we tried to work with them. In fact, we continue to work with them. I know some of the stories that I'd always intriguing to me for the Lewis and Clark Trail was the relationship between tribes, historical and even contemporary, how some of them still work together and maybe not work together. And again, what I'm thinking of right now is the tribes out of Fort Berthold, North Dakota. That's Amanda and Rikara. Again, as far as working with members of Lemhi Shoshone out of Salmon, Idaho. And again, as far as pronunciation of Sacagawea or Sacagawea. And again, that discussion went on for quite a while. It was amazing, some of the stories up there. We had people, and again, like Amy Mossett out of North Dakota, Roseanne Abrahamson out there in Fort Hall, Salmon, Idaho, again, to bring up the stories. Now it's really one of our successes that we thought, again, to bring up these discussions between the tribes. But it's amazing some of these stories that came out. And I know some of the Nisper stories, which I kind of touched upon during this time period. I know Alan, he knows some as well as I do. But one of the ones I used to focus on was on return journey in 1806, where the Core Discovery is working their way back home. They stayed in the place up there they called Lawn Camp up there, now present day Kamiah, Idaho. And they are stuck there for about a month because of the snow up in Lolo Pass. During that time period, Clark, and again, he sired a son. And I know that's something I used to get a kick out of, because I used to tell this story at Lewis and Clark gatherings, and I used to be a speaker for this. And some of the Lewis and Clark enthusiasts says, no, he wouldn't have done that because he was an officer and a gentleman. I tried to laugh because I'm also a veteran U.S. Army, and I know some of his officers and gentlemen. And but he did sire a child. And that child, he saw many things in his life. He saw the coming of the settlers and the soldiers, the treaties of 1855, 1863. And this son of Clark, even with the Nez campaign of 1877, with Chief Joseph Whitebird Looking Glass to Litsut, and they went all the way up to Bearpaw. He surrendered up there on October 5th, 1877. And the son of Clark went to Oklahoma as a prisoner of war. This was a son of Clark, and he died as a POW in Oklahoma. And again, that was a tragic story of what took place. So that's an example of untold stories that the tribes have. And I know right now, speaking to some of the tribal members that may be on here listening to this is an opportunity, and again, to reach out and tell your stories through AIANTA and whatever organizations that may come up. Because if you don't tell these stories, somebody is more than willing to reach out there and tell the story for you. So I think this is a grand opportunity for the tribal members to reach out and do this. And to the National Park Service employees that may be out here, use that consultation process and work with the tribes, again, to reach out to get those stories. A telephone call is not tribal consultation. Tribal consultation is reaching out to the tribe, meeting with them one-on-one, meeting with the tribal historic preservation officer, the chairman of the tribe, the governor of the tribe, whatever the case may be, and to meet with them, and again, to have a very good discussion with them and to glean information. I know one of the things that tribal, the the NPS always used to think about the tribes, says, well, the tribes change their leadership so often. The tribe's chairman may leave and all of a sudden there's somebody else, but the TIPO is typically right there all the time, no matter what administration. And you think about it in National Park Service, the superintendents change just as fast. Nez Perce National Historical Park has changed so many superintendents already. Again, some are good, some are bad, some are patronizing, and some just don't care. So, and again, be careful which way stones are thrown to the National Park Service. Be careful. On a personal note, again, I made a lot of good friends in some of the stories that were told. And again, some people like Cliff Schneider, and he was a member of the Chinook people over there in Washington, Oregon, and he was a personality and a half for the people that remember Cliff Schneider. I'd like someone to mention his name. He's a personal friend of mine, and he was a very unique individual. You know, Alan and I used to get along with him very well, and the first time we ever heard him was over there in Portland, I believe, or Vancouver. And that was something. Another person, Curly Bear Wagner, out of Blackfeet country. He himself was up there and was very, very, I mean, he wanted to tell these stories of the Blackfeet people to the trail system, to remember them, and also to talk about the impact of Lewis and Clark to the Blackfeet people. It's a powerful story. Another person, again, that I think about is Daryl Martin. Daryl Martin, again, he worked for the National Park Service for a while, doing the Tender Many Voices, and he is a member of the Fort Belknap people there in Montana, and he was a really outstanding individual. Dark Rain Tom, you know, she's out there somewhere too, and I think them and some of the work that's been done. And there's so many other people that I can reach out and say thank you to as far as what you can learn. Tribes, take advantage of this, please, to tell that untold story. You know, one of the things that they asked me to bring up as well too is some of the things that I may remember, which we call success. One thing about this whole thing about the bicentennial, and again, we talked about healing and reconciliation between the tribes and the non-Indian people. And I used to use the word healing as far as between the tribes and the non-Indians. And some people use reconciliation, which I don't, because if you reconcile, that means the books are balanced. As far as I'm concerned, the books will never be balanced between the tribes and also to the non-Indians. We have lost much, our Indian people. And that's something, again, too, where the books will never be balanced. But, you know, we can heal. We can heal between communities. We can heal between races, and especially this day and age, healing is so important, even now, even more so, even now. And this is what Lewis and Clark, I believe, showed. I know one of the things I always remember long ago by Weippe, Idaho. And now one time we had a gathering of that area, and if you're familiar with Weippe, that place used to be, and maybe still is, it's not very friendly to a tribal people, to my tribe, Nez Perce. And one time we had a gathering up there. We had some Nez Perce people up there and doing some things. We were eating together. And I was talking to the mayor, and Mr. Norm Stedman, I believe his name was, if I remember correctly. And we talked about it, and it says behind us, you see Indian kids playing with white kids. And I asked him, you remember, would you ever think this would ever happen? He says, no. Healing in process. And again, that's what I saw. So from many of my non-Indian friends throughout the whole trail, I began the sincerity to reach out and to work with the tribal people, which I believe was one of the real strongest points of the bicentennial. But again, let me just say, 20 minutes goes by fast, and again, that's this some of the themes. Oh yeah, and also National Park Service to the employees that's on here. So I understand there's quite a few of them. Work with Circle. Again, Circle is the Council of Indigenous Relevancy, Communication, Leadership, and Excellence. Alicia Deegan is the president of that, and she's based out of there in North Dakota. And work with her. And Circle is a very strong organization, again, to help you to reach out and teach you how to work with tribal people. You even tell you the idea to work, is it Native American or is it American Indian or what? to be Native American 101 classes for you. So take the opportunity as well, NPS. Do that. We can work together on this. So anyway, I'm going to just kind of conclude there, and I'll be anxious for your questions if you have some of the questions, and again to encourage the tribes to work with AIANTA, again to tell those untold stories, the stories that need to be told for the future generations. That's I can say on my part. At this time, let me introduce the next speaker. Our next speaker individual here is, as I mentioned, he has done an outstanding job here for the Nez Perce people and also for the trail. Mr. Alan Pinkham Sr., it's all yours.
All right, thank you, Otis. The thing that I got involved with here, I was a tribal liaison between the Nez Perce tribe and the Forest Service. Here in northern Idaho, we're surrounded by 5 national forests, and we had to set up a relationship with the Forest Service. I had worked there several years, and it was at Orfino, Idaho. And one of the fellows came up to me and said, well, how would you like to be a member of the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial Council? Because the Lewis and Clark so-called celebration was coming up. And I was curious, but at the same time, I thought, well, what is Lewis and Clark have to do with the Nez Perce tribe? You know, they never brought good news. But at the same time, I felt, well, what my father told me, he says, when a white man comes among us, he's going to bring us good things and bad things. And I always thought of that, what did that really mean? And so I decided, well, I'll go meet with the president of the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial. And his name was Harry Hubbard. And he was a Boeing executive, retired, and he was the president of the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial Council. So I went over to Seattle to talk with him. And he was very anxious about having, you know, some kind of tribal representation. And so I said, well, I'll agree to be on the Bicentennial Council. And so we had a meeting in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And of course, all the Lewis and Clark buffs and lawyers and historians, movie makers, college professors, were all there, and Jeannie Eater was also on Bicentennial Council at the same time. Actually, she was the one of the first ones, and I was only the second or third. And the discussion went like, well, gee, we're going to go celebrate Lewis and Clark Bicentennial, but we want Indians to be there. Well, be there didn't set well with Jeannie Eater, and of course the word celebration. She got up and she said, we will not celebrate Lewis and Clark Bicentennial. And we had a discussion about that word for about an hour, and we never settled the issue there, but then Jeannie and I decided that we would still participate because their attitude is like, well, we'll go showcase the tribes when we want them to be there. Or we'll have them ride horses and parades and drums, you know, and war dances. And so we had a meeting in Skamania, Washington. And that subject came up again. And there were some pretty harsh words spoken at that group. There was about 100 people there. And a word came up, and we said, we will not celebrate Lewis and Clark. And we found a different word, commemoration. And so we decided on that word, commemoration. And what changed a lot of attitudes, I think, is that because Jeannie Eater and Dark Rain Thome, and I think there was someone else there also. We decided that we should try to reconcile what we had just spoken about when there were some harsh words. And so we had a smudging ceremony. We got everybody in a circle, and I smudged everyone with sweetgrass and told them why I was doing that. And that was to, eliminate the harsh words, and that we had to work together, and that, we're holding no secrets, in our hands. And so then after that, after we had that little ceremony, things got a little bit better because people realized that there were some really hurt feelings out there about Lewis and Clark. And when we talked about good things and bad things that they brought, we always remembered mostly the bad things, the cessions of lands and other things. But then the attitude of that Bicentennial Council changed, and Harry Hubbard, he finally realized that, the corporate way of thinking doesn't work with Indian people. And he changed his attitude quite a bit. And once we decided that we would work with the Bicentennial Council, there was many people, initially after that, we said that we needed more representation from tribal people on a Bicentennial Council. And Amy Mossett, Dark Rain, of course, and Gerard Baker, Bobby Connor, and many others. And there were about roughly over 50 tribes that actually met with Lewis and Clark in 1804 through 06. But we needed not only just maybe a dozen or so, thought we needed a heck of a lot more tribal participation in Bicentennial. So we went out and developed an outreach program, and with contacting, tribal governments. We dealt with the tribal government and asked for representation from their tribe on a Bicentennial. But during that process, we formed a circle of tribal advisors. And there were probably around 30 that actively participated in this circle. And from there, the tribes raised so many issues that we couldn't ignore them. We had to address these issues that the tribes brought up, and a lot of it was funding. How are you going to participate in Lewis and Clark Bicentennial if we have no funding, no tourism organization, no staff, or even anyone to represent, their history or whatever they want to present in this Lewis and Clark Bicentennial. Well, the tribal priorities came about, and of course there were many issues. Basically, lack of funding, staff, and but some of the issues didn't even coincide with the Bicentennial, because their priorities were tribal economies, language restoration and protection, protection of graves, sacred sites, and then it went into the tribal economies and education. And there were so many issues that, how could we represent ourselves to the Bicentennial with so many issues? And especially the tourism. And as we got funding, there was a lot of corporations that donated huge amounts of money to the Bicentennial. And we argued, well, we need some funding for tribal participation. And then the Circle of Tribal Advisor course recommended that we should actively participate by developing our own historical accounts or events from the tribal perspective, not only historically, but getting the information that we want to hear about the tribe and the Lewis and Clark encounter. And quite a bit of it was negative, of course. And there were some Indians protesting. They wanted to send those river boats that were coming up the Missouri, told them to turn around and go back where you came from. And there was a group of Indian people that said that we're going to make those boats turn around. Well, I called this fellow up and talked with him and asked him, what he was going to do. And he says, well, I want to turn those boats around, and I want to tell them that we're not satisfied with this bicentennial because the impacts on my people were negative. And so he changed his attitude when I told the people on a bicentennial and the reenactors on the boats to listen to him. What is his real concern, and listen to him and even offer to help him if you could. And so when the tribal protest ended, there were more and better feelings than negative. And I think that also changed the attitude of some of our tribal people, because they felt, well, it's a second invasion coming up the river, and so that was the attitude of some of the tribal people. But at the same time, through CODA, we encouraged tribal participation, and we said, we will not constrain what you are going to tell about your tribal history or you're about to encounter with Lewis and Clark. And we changed some minds, and we had more participation, not only in CODA, but even in the signature events that we developed with the bicentennial and the National Park Service and the Forest Service, BLM, the Corps of Engineers, all the federal agencies participated, and also state agencies and even local communities in towns and cities, and universities, because universities carry the history or some kind of relationship with tribes if this college or university is in tribal territories. So, and actually there was some Indian people with the universities that participated. So the Bicentennial Council and a Circle of Tribal Advisors, their activities expanded tremendously because we got more funding from corporations like Hewitt and Q West, and there was a big long list, and millions of dollars started to pour in. And the tribes through CODA got, I believe it was about 5 million to do their Lewis and Clark, either tourism or signature events, or even some kind of seminar if they wanted to hold one, and they could tell their own story, and they would be uncensored, and whatever they said, the public would have to accept. And so we thought this was a lot better than what had previously been proposed, like we're going to have Indians come in and ride horses and parade and drum and war dance, and we weren't going to go for that kind of thing. We wanted more inclusion, more consultation, and participation. And I think we arrived at, we never got all the tribes, all 50-some tribes involved, but we got some major tribes involved, and they provided some and developed some tourism departments for their tribal programs. So in that respect, that was real good. And one of the things that came up was, how do you react to tribes when you want to interact with tribes. And one of the things that we discussed was you need to contact the tribal government to work with, to consult with, to develop any activities or whatever the issues are. And then another question was raised, well, who is an Indian? Well, there's all kinds of Indian representation out there. There's treaty tribes, there's non-treaty tribes, there's executive order tribes, there's state recognized tribes, and there's remnants of tribal people out there that are, you know, still organized in some respect, but they're not enrolled, they're not member of any tribal government. And so there was a big, diverse tribal organizations out there. And we had to decide, well, who's an Indian and who is not. And it was one of those tough issues that we had to address. And the only way we could do that was to officially contact the tribal government and then work through the tribal government, then whether there was a treaty or non-treaty or executive order or state recognized. But they had to be organized in some way. And of course, when we said we'd only deal with the tribal governments, you know, the non-recognized and remnant bands were upset about it, but we had to make some kind of determination like that. So some of the issues that we addressed were very, very contentious. And one of the things that needs to be done if we are going to deal with this same kind of participation from tribes is the contact with the tribal government. There's, you know, other ways to do it, but I think on a formal basis and a proper way to do that is to contact the tribal government, and they will designate a representation to whatever you're trying to do. Like the 250th observance of Lewis and Clark expedition, I'm sure that will probably be done. And one of the things that we did, Bob Archibald, the Missouri Historical Society director at the time, had $2 million left over in our coffers after the bicentennial was completed. And I believe it was Bob suggested, well, what's one of the biggest issues and priorities of tribal governments? And language protection and graves protection are probably up there near the top. And so we suggested, well, why don't we, if there's $2 million left over, why don't we put one for, you know, some legacy of Lewis and Clark bicentennial, and it could fund various things along the trail on a yearly basis. And then $1 million for tribal language preservation or enhancement. And so we thought that was a great idea. And we had a little discussion about it in the assembly, but we did get that done. And now out of Yale University, there's a language preservation program that we donated this $1 million to. So that was one of the priorities of the tribes, and that worked out pretty well. And so hopefully we'll be able to, you know, do other things like this if we want to observe or commemorate the 250th anniversary of the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial with tribal participation. Is that all for now?
You can continue if you'd like, either Otis or Alan. We have time. We don't really have any questions in the Q&A that we can address. So if you'd like to continue for another 5 minutes, you may do so.
You know, the Sacagawea issue, you know, we talked about that pretty extensive, you know, and you know, in those days there were slaves, Indian slaves, you know, they were captured usually as young people, and there's various purposes for doing that. Some is to we would capture Shoshone Bannock people, or you know, maybe someone out on the plains. What some of that, it was to learn the language so that we could deal with other tribal organizations. And others, it was sometimes for labor lost in a family group. And sometimes the slaves were treated well, and sometimes harshly. But at the same time, once they participated in the tribe, and they were sometimes were even adopted into the tribe, but they were also offered their freedom. And it didn't happen all the time, but there was various options for slaves at that time. And Sacagawea being captured and taken out on the plains, you know, who does she really belong to was one of the questions. And it's hard to determine because, you know, the notes from, I think, I believe at Fort Manuel, that it said Charbonneau's wife had passed away. I think this was in 1815, I believe. And so she was buried there, but of course it's inundated by one of the dams on the Missouri. And so now we can't go and verify the grave, but it developed a controversy. And I met a young lady during the bicentennial, and she said, well, Sacagawea is alive. She was in Wyoming, and she's buried in Wyoming. And so there's various reasons how that could have occurred. But at the same time, Indian people say that Sacagawea lived on and became an old elderly lady, and is buried in Wyoming. And so there's a controversy lives on. And how do we address it? Well, there's various scenarios. There could be a close relative of Sacagawea, maybe her sister, that could have taken on the persona of Sacagawea and represented her in Wyoming. And of course, there's a lot of documentation that from some of the white society in Wyoming that they accommodated Sacagawea in Wyoming. You know, gave her stage rides and gave her, you know, donated things to her because of her name. And so in the Indian world, she still existed. But then at the same time, other tribes or so the Shoshone people, some of them say, well, yes, she did die in Fort Manuel. So it's a controversial issue, and but the Nespers have our own little version of Sacagawea. And so, and in our version is that she came here to visit us here, and then the daughter of Chief Timothy, who was named Jane, went to Wyoming to visit Sacagawea and exchange dresses with her. And that dress supposedly existed at a Spalding museum at one time. But now that dress is disappeared. And we don't, I and Steve Evans looked for it and couldn't find it. But this is just one of the kind of an offshoot of this Lewis and Clark story. And so the controversy lives on, I guess you'd say.
I think of some of the impacts of Lewis and Clark, and that's some part of the things that we did talk to the tribes during the Lewis and Clark, before Lewis and Clark, during, and even after. The Nespers people also ran into Clark as well in 1830s, because he was in charge down there in St. Louis, Missouri, head of the department at that time. And we had 4 chiefs that went down there to visit with him, and began to ask him for different things. But anyway, they went down there. 2 of the Nez Perce chiefs died. And we often wonder whatever happened to the graves of those 2 Nez Perce men. The National Park Service to Bob Moore. Mr. Bob Moore, he worked out at the Arch there in St. Louis. He did a lot of research, and we found the 2 graves of these Nez Perce men. And because of the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial, we would have never probably even researched that. But we found it, and through the research of Bob Moore, we found the grave sites of these 2 men. And a whole bunch of us went down there, and we had a ceremony. There's a monument put up there, and they're buried at the Bellefontaine Cemetery there in St. Louis. So there's a lot of other things, idea of we used to talk about before the trail, during the trail, and after the trail. And now it's kind of some of the things that we used to try to push there to be told by the tribes. And there's a question that came up there about the son of Clark. And yeah, yes, he died down there, and so I understand he did have a child, but the lineage is pretty near lost as far as what happened. It said he died down there in I'd probably say 1881, 1882, and he did have children. Much of that's lost, though. They didn't really take down some of these things, and I don't think some of the soldiers at the time really wanted to believe that they did this. And that was the irony of the whole story, because the Nez Perce greeted these lost white guys, and we always used to say, we discovered Lewis and Clark. They did not discover us. These white guys were lost. And so that's kind of some of the things we used to joke about. A lot of humor came out. Alan and I used to have a good laugh about a lot of different things, about the stories the tribes would talk about. Behind closed doors, we'd be joking around about different things. But again, to the non-Indians that's out there, we understand one thing about us Indian people. We have a sense of humor. And by golly, we have a chance, we're going to tease you to no end. And again, you'll be sorry.
Otis. So Otis, that brings me to this question from one of our participants. Let me find it here. She wants to know if you could repeat the name of that 101 course and how it can be accessed.
That particular course is, I'm not sure. Like I said, I've been retired. Contact Alicia Deegan. Alicia Deegan. She's out of North Dakota. She's a superintendent out there in Knife River Indian Villages. She's also the president for Circle, the Council of Indigenous Relevancy, Communication, Leadership, and Excellence. And that organization is composed of Indigenous people of the National Park Service, and also to include Hawaii and also to Alaska. And we have superintendents on there, we have worker bees, we have and so forth. So by contact Alicia Deegan, she's a superintendent of Knife River Indian Villages. She's a member of the Mandan Hidatsa tribe and out of there in Fort Berthold. So call her up, visit with her, and ask that same question there. I've been retired and out of the loop, but if anybody would know, Alicia would know.
Okay, Otis, and there's another question here for you. Does the son of Clark have a name that is known? And where was he housed in Oklahoma when he died?
They call him daytime smoker. I'm not sure how that name can survive long, but that's the name that was reported. He used to go around there in the area and say, "I am son of Clark. I'm son of Clark." They say he had reddish hair, and but again, that was his name. As far as down there by Tonkawa, Oklahoma, and that's where the Nez Perce were sent to as prisoners. Nez Perce we call Oklahoma AIANTA, which means hot place. And that's where Chief Joseph was sent after 1877, after he surrendered there on October 5th, 1877, and that's where daytime smoker went as well as a prisoner.
I know the Otis, the name of Clark's son was Halachtuket. Halachtuket.
Yes.
And we also called Clark Halachtuket because he was a smoker, and we would sit down and smoke with him. And so when his son came about, we just named him after his father, Halachtuket.
That's a good name.
Well, that's all the questions we have right now that we can address. Those that were not addressed here, we will answer those offline for you. So we want to thank you again for joining us, and we will be posting this webinar on the AIANTA website, and we'll send a link to your email addresses. So please follow us at ianta.org/webinar series for future webinars hosted by AIANTA. If you are not a member of AIANTA or not listed on the nativeamerica.travel and would like to be, please contact Gail Shehak, Tribal Relations and Outreach Manager, by email at gchehak@ianta.org. Again, thank you, everyone. We appreciate you being here today, and have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.